June 4, 1942, 10:24 a.m. Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. At 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky banked his SBD Dauntless and looked down. What he saw defied expectation. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in diamond formation, their flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Ordnance carts stood beside waiting bombers. Fuel lines snaked across wooden planking. The carriers were in the midst of rearming for a second strike, precisely the moment they were most vulnerable. This was not supposed to happen. For 2 hours, McClusky had searched empty ocean. His fuel gauges neared critical. 32 dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet followed him into what seemed like a futile mission. Intelligence had placed the Japanese fleet elsewhere. Torpedo Squadron 8 had already been annihilated. 15 planes shot down. Only one survivor. The American attack was fragmenting. But 30 minutes earlier, McClusky had made a decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Finding nothing at the expected intercept point, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing northeast at flank speed, returning from a depth charge run on the submarine Nautilus. On instinct, McClusky turned to follow its wake. Now, at 10:24, he pushed his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive. Behind him, 31 more bombers followed. The Japanese had no radar. Their combat air patrol, Zeros that had just finished slaughtering American torpedo bombers, was down at sea level. The sky above the carriers was empty. In the next 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, would be mortally wounded. By nightfall, all 4 would be gone. The core of the Kido Butai, the carrier force that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, would be annihilated. To understand why those 5 minutes mattered, not just tactically, but strategically, industrially, and historically, we must examine not only what happened, but why it was possible, and why Japan could not recover. Japan entered 1942 at the apex of its power. In 6 months, it had conquered territory larger than Europe, Hong Kong in 18 days, Manila in 26, Singapore in 70. The British were driven from Malaya, the Dutch from Indonesia, the Americans from the Philippines. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier striking force had never been defeated. It had sunk 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, and routed the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, sinking the carrier Hermes and 2 cruisers. Its pilots were veterans of combat in China since 1937. The Mitsubishi A6M0 outperformed every Allied fighter in the Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, and Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, which held that superior will and training could overcome material disadvantage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed this too. Yet he also knew Japan could not win a protracted war against American industry. His solution: force a decisive engagement that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before American production could ramp up. Midway was that gamble. The plan was ambitious. A diversionary attack on the Aleutians would draw American attention north. Meanwhile, the main force, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, and 15 submarines, would seize Midway and lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. On paper, the odds were overwhelming. The 4 fleet carriers carried 248 aircraft and the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The battleship Yamato, flagship of the combined fleet, displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18-inch guns. the largest naval rifles ever built. Against this, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter had been heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, and should have required 3 months of repairs. Instead, 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard labored around the clock for 72 hours, patching her hull, restoring power, and rearming her flight deck. Good enough for one more battle. Yet the Americans held one decisive advantage. They knew the Japanese were coming. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had broken JN-25, the Japanese naval code. By late May, they had confirmed Midway as the target, June 4th as the date, and the approach route of the carrier force. Admiral Chester Nimitz used this intelligence to position his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. But intelligence alone does not win battles. Execution does. And on the morning of June 4th, American execution was chaotic, and nearly disastrous. Marine fighters from Midway were slaughtered by Zeros. Army B-17s bombing from 20,000 feet scored no hits. Marine scout bombers were shot down in flames. Then came the torpedo squadrons. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked alone, without fighter escort, without coordination. All 15 TBD devastators were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the Pacific, watching the battle unfold. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 planes. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, only 6 returned. Not one scored a torpedo hit. The attacks seemed suicidal, and in material terms, they were. But they achieved something intangible yet critical. They pulled every Japanese Zero down to sea level. Dozens of fighters swarmed the low-flying devastators, their pilots focused on immediate threats. None were watching the sky above. On the bridge of Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, veteran of Pearl Harbor, author of the attack plan, watched with a mixture of contempt and respect. The courage of the American crews impressed him, but their attacks had failed. Not one carrier was damaged. What Fuchida did not realize was that those failed attacks had created the conditions for success. At 10:20, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, finally received confirmation of American carriers to the northeast. We ordered a second strike. 87 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, were readied on the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Engines warmed. Bombs were moved from magazines to decks. Torpedoes were rolled into position. It was the worst possible moment. At 10:24, McClusky's dive bombers arrived. They fell from 14,000 feet at 260 miles per hour, howling down at 70-degree angles. Anti-aircraft guns, calibrated for low-altitude torpedo bombers, could not elevate fast enough. Zeros were miles away and thousands of feet too low. The carriers, turning into the wind for launch, could not maneuver. At 2,500 feet, the pilots released 500-pound armor-piercing bombs with delayed fuses designed to penetrate flight decks before exploding in hangar bays. The first bomb struck Kaga just aft of the island. It detonated aviation fuel and armed ordnance stacked on the deck. A second hit the forward elevator. A third struck the port side. A fourth obliterated the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most senior officers. Within 60 seconds, Kaga, 38,000 tons, veteran of every major operation since Pearl Harbor, was a funeral pyre. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best, realizing most bombers were converging on Kaga, pulled his two wingmen out of their dives, and turned toward Akagi. His bomb struck amidships, penetrated the flight deck, and exploded in the hangar, where fueled and armed aircraft were being reconfigured for the second strike. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fuchida, on the bridge, saw 3 black dots plummeting toward him. Seconds later, the blast lifted him off his feet. On Soryu, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, delivered 3 precise hits in quick succession: forward elevator, amidships, aft. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes cooked off. Within minutes, the 18,000-ton carrier was engulfed. The attack lasted 5 minutes. When it ended, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning beyond salvation. Over 240 aircraft, many of them the core of Japan's naval air power, were destroyed on deck or trapped below. More than 700 pilots and aircrew, men trained over years with combat experience dating to the China War, were dead or dying in the flames. This was not just a loss of ships. It was a loss of irreplaceable human capital. Japan's pilot training pipeline was rigorous but narrow. Washout rates exceeded 80%. It took 2 to 3 years to produce a carrier-qualified pilot. By contrast, the U.S. Navy, drawing on civilian flight schools and standardized curricula, could train a pilot in 6 months. In 1942, Japan began the year with approximately 1,500 experienced carrier pilots. After Midway, fewer than 1,000 remained. The pipeline could not keep pace with losses. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups were filled with pilots who had fewer than 100 flight hours, many with no carrier landing experience. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots dubbed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, shooting down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The carriers themselves were equally irreplaceable. Japan had 6 fleet carriers at the start of the war. After Midway, 4 were gone. The 2 survivors, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were damaged at Coral Sea and would not return to action for months. Japanese shipyards, constrained by limited steel, skilled labor, and industrial capacity, could produce perhaps 1 fleet carrier per year under ideal conditions. The United States, by contrast, commissioned 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers by the end of 1943. By war's end, the U.S. Navy operated over 100 carriers of all types. But the disparity went beyond numbers. It extended to design philosophy. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive punch over survivability. Aviation fuel lines ran exposed across hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes were stored without blast shields. Damage control systems were minimal. The carriers could deliver devastating strikes, but could not absorb a single hit. American carriers, though not immune to damage, incorporated lessons from early war losses: enclosed hangars, fire curtains, redundant pumping systems, and better compartmentalization improved survivability. Yorktown, though sunk at Midway, absorbed 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes before succumbing, testament to resilient design. Strategically, Midway exposed another Japanese vulnerability: overcomplexity. Yamamoto's plan involved multiple task forces operating hundreds of miles apart, battleships too distant to support carriers, invasion forces unable to intervene, a diversion in the Aleutians that drew away precious assets. When American intelligence revealed the full scheme, the complexity became a liability. Forces were dispersed. Coordination collapsed. Nimitz's plan was simpler: concentrate available carriers, wait, and strike. Though American attacks were poorly coordinated, squadrons arrived piecemeal, torpedo and dive bombers unsynchronized. The sheer volume of effort created opportunity. War is not won by perfect execution, but by systems that function even when components fail. The American system, intelligence, industry, decentralized command, redundancy, worked. The Japanese system, centralized, brittle, reliant on flawless execution, did not. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack. Under Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, she launched 2 counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown. But by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, American scouts located her. Dive bombers from Enterprise delivered 4 bomb hits. Fires raged out of control. Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most brilliant officers, refused to abandon ship. He and Captain Tomeo Kaku went down with Hiryu at 2:30 in the morning on June 5th. The scope of the defeat was staggering. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced naval aviators and technicians. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, Hammond, 147 aircraft, and 307 men. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. But the real difference lay in what came after. America replaced its losses. Japan could not. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the news in disbelief. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, he ordered the operation abandoned. The invasion fleet turned for home. The battleships never fired a shot. The Aleutian diversion achieved nothing. For Japan, Midway marked the end of strategic initiative. From that day forward, it fought a defensive war, reacting, retreating, losing island after island. 2 months later, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. The attrition of pilots and ships accelerated. By 1944, the carrier force was a hollow shell, used as bait in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Empty of aircraft, crewed by novices, sacrificed to draw American attention from battleship groups. Fuchida, rescued from Akagi with broken ankles, spent the rest of the war as a staff officer. In his 1955 book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, he acknowledged American intelligence, pilot courage, and leadership. He wrote plainly, "Japan lost the war at Midway. McClusky returned to Enterprise with 52 bullet holes in his plane, a shoulder wound, and less than 5 gallons of fuel. He received the Navy Cross, but never called himself a hero. I just did my job," he said. That modesty reflects a deeper truth. Midway was not won by a single hero, but by a network of contributors, the cryptanalysts who read JN-25, the shipyard workers who rebuilt Yorktown in 72 hours, the torpedo bomber crews who died drawing zeros low, the destroyer Arashi steaming northeast at the right time, McClusky's judgment to follow it. 5 minutes, 300 seconds decided the Pacific War. Before 10:24 a.m., Japan still had a chance, however slim, to negotiate a favorable peace. After 10:29 a.m., that chance was gone. Everything that followed, the island-hopping campaign, the firebombing of cities, the atomic bombs, was the working out of an inevitable conclusion. The bombs that fell on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu did not reflect American superiority in courage or fighting spirit. The Japanese pilots who died in the flames were as brave as any in history. Victory came from intelligence, industrial capacity, systemic resilience, and the accumulation of small advantages over time. Japan had skill. America had everything else. And in modern warfare, everything else wins. The Battle of Midway endures not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson in the machinery of modern war. It reminds us that victory is rarely the product of a single moment or a single man, but of systems, preparation, and the quiet labor of thousands whose names never appear in headlines. If you value history told with rigor, respect, and depth, if you believe the men who lived these events deserve more than myth or melodrama, we invite you to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to preserving the real story of World War II, not as entertainment, but as legacy. Because for those who served, and for those who remember them, truth is the highest form of honor.